The morning Clara Anderson walked into Thornton's general store with all 6 of her children trailing behind her like ducklings. She had exactly $3.47 to her name, which was not nearly enough to keep 7 people fed through the coming winter of 1883. Lordsburg, New Mexico Territory, was an unforgiving place for a woman alone, and Clara had been alone for 8 months now. Ever since consumption took her husband Robert and left her with 6 hungry mouths and a debt-ridden homestead that was barely holding together. The bell above the door chimed as Clara entered, her oldest daughter Sarah, who had just turned 15, holding baby Matthew on her hip while the other 4 children clustered around their mother's worn calico skirt. Clara could feel the weight of judgment from the other customers in the store, could practically hear their whispered conversations about the poor widow woman who could not manage to keep her brood in line or her life together. Her cheeks burned with shame, but she held her head high anyway because pride was about the only thing she had left that was worth anything. "Mama, I am hungry," whispered 7-year-old William, tugging at her sleeve with persistent fingers. "I know, sweetheart." "We will eat when we get home," Clara said softly, though she knew the pantry held nothing but some cornmeal and a few withered potatoes. She moved through the store with practiced efficiency, calculating every penny in her head as she selected the bare necessities. 10 pounds of flour, salt, a small amount of sugar, some dried beans. It would have to be enough. She was standing at the counter, counting out her precious coins with trembling fingers while Mr. Thornton tallied her purchases with a skeptical expression, when she realized she was $2 short. Her stomach dropped like a stone down a well. "I am sorry, Mrs. Anderson, but I cannot extend any more credit," Mr. Thornton said, not unkindly but firmly nonetheless. "You still owe from last month." Clara felt the familiar sting of tears behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not in front of everyone. I understand. I will put back the sugar and half the flour." "Mama, no," Sarah said quietly from behind her, but Clara did not turn around. She could not bear to see the worry in her daughter's eyes, the fear that had become all too familiar in recent months. That was when a deep voice spoke from behind them, calm and steady as river stones. "I will cover what she needs." Clara turned to find herself looking up at Bennett Yancy, a rancher who lived several miles outside of town. She had seen him before, of course, in church on Sundays when she managed to get the children there, and occasionally in town when he came for supplies. But they had never spoken beyond polite nods of acknowledgement. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and weathered by sun and wind, probably somewhere in his early 30s. His face was all hard angles and serious lines, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of steel in winter. There was something about the way he stood, quiet and self-contained, that suggested a man who was comfortable with silence and his own company. "Sir, I cannot accept," Clara said immediately, her pride flaring up despite her desperate circumstances. "It is no trouble," Bennett said, already reaching into his pocket. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. "Winter is coming. Children need to eat." The simplicity of his statement, the lack of judgment or pity in his tone, made something in Clara's chest tighten painfully. She wanted to refuse again, wanted to maintain some scrap of dignity, but William was tugging at her skirt and baby Matthew was starting to fuss, and she was so tired, so desperately tired of trying to hold everything together with nothing but willpower and prayer. "Thank you," she managed, the words barely more than a whisper. "I will find a way to repay you." Bennett handed the money to Mr. Thornton, who accepted it with raised eyebrows that suggested this was the most interesting thing to happen in his store in quite some time. "No need for repayment," Bennett said to Clara. "Consider it neighborly assistance." Before Clara could respond, Bennett had touched the brim of his hat in farewell and walked out of the store, the bell chiming his departure. Clara stood there with her children around her, holding the precious supplies that would keep them fed for another few weeks, and wondered who Bennett Yancy really was beneath that quiet exterior. The truth was, Bennett had been noticing Clara Anderson for longer than he cared to admit, even to himself. He had first seen her last spring at the church social, before her husband died, when she had been laughing at something Robert said while holding baby Matthew against her shoulder. There had been something about the sound of her laughter, bright and genuine, that had caught his attention and held it. Then Robert had died and Clara's laughter had died with him, replaced by a haunted look in her green eyes and a tightness around her mouth that spoke of constant worry. Bennett had never been a man of many words. He had grown up on his father's ranch, learned early that work mattered more than talk, and after his father passed 5 years ago, he had inherited the land and the cattle and the solitary life that came with it. He was not lonely exactly. Loneliness implied a longing for something different, and Bennett had been content with his existence. Until he started noticing Clara Anderson and her 6 children, and suddenly, his well-ordered life seemed emptier than it had before. He knew what people in town said about him, that he was strange, too quiet, too much alone, that at 32 years old he should have found himself a wife by now instead of living out on his ranch with no company but his horses and cattle. Bennett did not particularly care what people thought, but he did care that Clara might refuse his help out of pride or propriety, which was why he had kept his assistance to that single moment in the general store, and then removed himself from the situation before she could protest further. But as he rode his horse back toward his ranch that afternoon, the New Mexico sun beating down on his shoulders and the endless sky stretching above him, Bennett could not stop thinking about the look on Clara's face when she had been $2 short. The way her hands had trembled as she counted her coins. The quiet desperation in her voice when she said she would put back the necessities her children needed. Something about it had struck him deep in his chest, in a place he had not known was still capable of feeling much of anything, and he knew with sudden certainty that he was not going to be able to walk away and leave her to struggle alone. The question was what to do about it. Bennett was not a man who acted rashly or without careful consideration. He thought about the problem the way he thought about everything else in his life, turning it over in his mind while he did his evening chores, examining it from all angles while he ate his solitary dinner, working through the possibilities while he lay in his bed staring at the ceiling that night. By the time dawn broke over the eastern horizon, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and pink, Bennett had made his decision. It was not a romantic decision, or even a particularly emotional one. It was practical, logical, and mutually beneficial. Clara needed help, and Bennett needed something too, though he was only beginning to admit to himself what that something might be. 3 days later, Clara was in her kitchen trying to make a decent meal out of the supplies Bennett had purchased, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching the homestead. Through the window, she could see a lone rider, and her heart sank even as she recognized Bennett's tall figure in the saddle. She had been dreading this moment, had known he would come eventually to collect on the debt despite his words about not needing repayment, because men always wanted something in return, did they not? She wiped her hands on her apron and went outside, leaving Sarah to watch the younger children. Bennett had dismounted by the time she reached him, and he was standing by his horse with his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable in a way that was almost endearing despite Clara's wariness. "Mr. Yancy," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I am afraid I do not have any money to repay you yet, but if you could give me a few more weeks, I did not come for repayment, Bennett interrupted, then seemed to realize how abrupt that sounded and cleared his throat. "I came to talk to you about a proposal, a business arrangement." Clara crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly cold despite the warm afternoon. "What kind of arrangement?" Bennett shifted his weight, clearly struggling to find the right words. It was strange to see such a large, capable-looking man appear so uncertain. "Your husband's homestead is failing. You have 6 children to feed and winter coming on. You need help." "And you think you can provide that help?" Clara asked, unable to keep the defensive edge from her tone. "For what price, Mr. Yancy? What exactly do you want from me?" Bennett met her eyes directly, and there was no guile in his gaze, no hidden meanings or inappropriate suggestions. Just that same steady honesty that had characterized his actions in the general store. "I want you to marry me." Of all the things Clara had expected him to say, that was not among them. She actually laughed, a short, startled sound. "You cannot be serious." "I am serious," Bennett said. He was still holding his hat, turning it slowly in his hands. "It would be a practical arrangement. You need financial security and help with the homestead. I need a wife to help run my household and to provide companionship. We would both benefit." "Companionship," Clara repeated, her mind reeling. "You want to marry me for companionship?" "And because I think you are a good woman who deserves better than to watch her children go hungry," Bennett said. "And because I have a ranch that is successful enough to support a family. And because your children need a father figure, and I think I could provide that." Clara stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. It was insane. Completely insane. They barely knew each other. They had exchanged perhaps a dozen words before today. And yet, as she stood there in front of her failing homestead with the weight of impossible responsibilities pressing down on her shoulders, she could not immediately dismiss the idea out of hand. "You do not know anything about me," she said finally. "Or my children. 6 children, Mr. Yancy." 6. Do you have any idea what that would mean?" "I know it would mean a full house and a lot of noise and a lot of work," Bennett said. "I know it would mean I would never eat alone again or spend my evenings in silence. I know it would mean taking on responsibility for 7 people instead of just myself, and I am willing to do that." "Why?" Clara demanded, moving closer to him so she could search his face for any sign of deception. "Why would you want that? You do not even know us." Bennett was quiet for a long moment, and Clara could see him considering his words carefully. "Because I am tired of being alone," he said finally, and the simple honesty in his voice made her breath catch. "And because when I saw you in the store, counting your coins and trying so hard to keep yourself together for your children's sake, I thought that you might be tired of being alone too. Not the same kind of alone, maybe, but alone nonetheless." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She was alone. So terribly alone. She had not realized how alone she felt until Bennett put it into words, standing there in front of her with his hat in his hands and something almost like hope in his steel-gray eyes. "I do not love you," Clara said, because she needed to be clear about this if nothing else. "I know," Bennett said. "I do not expect you to. This would be a marriage of convenience, not romance. Separate rooms. No expectations beyond what you were willing to give. I would provide for you and the children, and you would help me run the household. That is all." Clara wanted to say no. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to refuse this ridiculous proposal from a man she did not know, to maintain her independence and find some other way to survive. But as she looked back at the homestead, at the roof that was starting to cave in and the fields that had gone mostly unplanted this year, because she could not manage the work alone, and thought about winter coming and her children going hungry, she knew there was no other way. This was the lifeline she had been praying for, even if it came in a form she had never anticipated. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. Bennett nodded, putting his hat back on his head. "Take all the time you need. But winter does not wait, Mrs. Anderson, and neither does hunger." He mounted his horse and rode away without another word, leaving Clara standing in her yard with a head full of thoughts that would not settle into any kind of order. She went back inside to find Sarah watching her with worried eyes. "Who was that man, Mama?" Sarah asked. "A neighbor," Clara said, moving back to the stove where the meager stew was simmering. "No one for you to worry about." But that night, after all the children were finally asleep, crowded together in the 2 small bedrooms that were all the homestead could provide, Clara sat at the kitchen table with a cup of weak tea and forced herself to think through Bennett's proposal with a clear head. On one side of the ledger were all the reasons to refuse. She barely knew the man. It had only been 8 months since Robert died, and marrying again so soon would certainly cause talk in town. She would be giving up what little independence she had left, putting herself and her children under the control of a man who was essentially a stranger. And what if he turned out to be cruel or violent or demanding in ways she had not anticipated? But on the other side of the ledger was survival. Food for her children, a roof that did not leak, security for the coming winter and all the winters after, a father figure for her sons and daughters who desperately needed guidance and stability. And beyond the practical considerations, there was something else, something harder to define. The quiet honesty in Bennett's eyes when he said he was tired of being alone. The fact that he had helped her in the store without expecting anything in return. The way he had made his proposal as an equal, not as a man assuming authority over a desperate woman. Clara did not sleep much that night, and when morning came, she still did not have an answer. But as she made breakfast from the supplies Bennett had purchased, stretching them as far as they would go, while William and 9-year-old twins James and Joseph argued over who got to sit in the good chair, and 5-year-old Lucy cried because she had torn her only dress, and Sarah walked baby Matthew around the kitchen because he was fussing, Clara felt the weight of her impossible situation pressing down on her like a physical force. She gave herself 3 days before riding into town to ask around about Bennett Yancy. She was careful about it, making it seem like idle curiosity rather than serious investigation, but the answers she got were surprisingly consistent. Bennett kept to himself, but he was known to be honest in his dealings. He paid his bills on time and treated his ranch hands fairly. He was quiet, maybe even strange in his quietness, but no one had a bad word to say about his character. He had never been married, had never even been seriously involved with a woman as far as anyone knew, which struck some people as odd but which Clara found reassuring rather than concerning. On the 4th day after Bennett's visit, Clara dressed in her best dress, which was not saying much, and braided her dark blonde hair with trembling fingers. She left Sarah in charge of the children, which she hated doing because 15 was too young for such responsibility, but she had no choice. Then she hitched up their old horse to the wagon that was nearly falling apart and drove herself to Bennett's ranch. She had never been to his property before, and she was struck immediately by how well maintained everything was. The fences were straight and strong. The barn was in good repair. The house itself was a solid structure of wood and stone, larger than she had expected, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and side. It looked like a place where a family could be happy, she thought, then immediately pushed the thought away because she could not afford to think in terms of happiness. This was about survival, nothing more. Bennett must have heard her approach because he came out of the barn before she had even set the brake on the wagon. He was in his work clothes, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms tanned dark by the sun and corded with muscle from years of hard labor. There was surprise on his face, quickly masked, but he waited patiently while she climbed down from the wagon, not offering help unless she needed it, which she appreciated. "Mrs. Anderson," he said in greeting. "Mr. Yancy." Clara swallowed hard, trying to find the courage she needed. "I have thought about your proposal." Bennett went very still. In the bright afternoon sunlight, she could see that his eyes were not plain gray after all, but had flecks of blue in them like storm clouds. "And I have conditions," Clara said, deciding that directness was the best approach. "If I agree to this marriage, I need to know exactly what you expect from me. I need separate rooms, as you mentioned. I need assurance that you will provide for all 6 of my children equally, without favoring any over the others. I need to know that you will be patient with them while they adjust to this change, and I need your word that you will not try to replace their father in their hearts. Robert was their father. You would be their stepfather. There is a difference." "Agreed," Bennett said without hesitation. "Anything else?" Clara took a breath. "I need to know that if this does not work, if we find we cannot live together peacefully, you will not leave me and the children destitute. I need some assurance of security even if the marriage fails." For the first time, something like hurt flashed across Bennett's face, so quickly she almost missed it. "I am not the kind of man who abandons his responsibilities, Mrs. Anderson. If we marry, I will honor that commitment regardless of what happens between us. You and your children would be provided for under any circumstance." The firmness in his voice, the absolute conviction, made something in Clara's chest ease slightly. "Then I accept," she said, the words coming out steadier than she felt. "I will marry you, Mr. Yancy." Bennett's expression did not change much, but she saw his shoulders relax slightly, as if he had been holding tension he had not realized was there. "When?" "As soon as it can be arranged, I suppose," Clara said. "There is no point in waiting. Winter will be here before we know it." "Next week, then," Bennett said. "I will speak to Reverend Matthews and make the arrangements. Will that give you enough time to prepare the children?" Clara almost laughed at the idea that a week could possibly be enough time to prepare her children for the fact that their mother was marrying a stranger, and they would all be moving to a new home. But what choice did she have? It will have to be enough. "You should bring them here," Bennett said suddenly. "Before the wedding. Let them see the house and the ranch. Let them get comfortable with the idea." It was a thoughtful suggestion, one that surprised Clara with its sensitivity. "That would be helpful, yes, thank you." They stood there for a moment in awkward silence. Two people who had just agreed to spend their lives together without really knowing anything about each other. Finally, Bennett cleared his throat and said, "Would you like to see the house now, since you are here?" Clara nodded, and Bennett led her toward the house with careful, measured steps, as if he was afraid she might bolt like a frightened horse. The interior was clean but sparse, furnished with the basics but lacking any personal touches that might have made it feel like a home. The kitchen was larger than her entire homestead, with a proper stove and a hand pump for water right inside. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, all of good size, and a parlor with a fireplace that looked like it would keep the whole house warm through the coldest winter nights. The children could share the 2 larger bedrooms, Bennett said as he showed her around. "One for the girls, one for the boys. You would have the 3rd room. I have been sleeping in the small room off the kitchen, and I would continue to do so." Clara noticed that he was being very careful not to make any assumptions about their sleeping arrangements, and she appreciated it even as the whole situation felt increasingly surreal. This was really happening. She was really going to marry this quiet, serious man and move her children to his ranch and try to make some kind of life together out of mutual necessity and nothing else. "It is a good house," she said finally, because she needed to say something and it was the truth. "The children will like it here." "I hope so," Bennett said, and there was something vulnerable in his voice that made Clara look at him more closely. "I have never been around children much. I will do my best, but I will make mistakes." "We all make mistakes," Clara said softly. "That is part of being human." Bennett met her eyes, and for just a moment there was a connection between them, a shared understanding that they were both taking an enormous risk and hoping it would somehow work out. Then the moment passed, and they were back to being near strangers discussing logistics. But Clara carried that brief sense of connection with her as she drove back to her homestead, and it made the whole impossible situation feel slightly less terrifying. Telling the children was harder than Clara had anticipated. Sarah, at 15, understood the practicalities immediately, but was clearly unhappy about being uprooted from the only home she had ever known. The twins, James and Joseph, were suspicious and full of questions about whether this new man would be mean to them. William was confused and kept asking if this meant they would have a new papa, which broke Clara's heart every time. Lucy was too young to fully understand and was mainly concerned about whether she could bring her doll. And baby Matthew, at 14 months old, was blissfully unaware of the entire situation. "I do not want a new father," James said stubbornly, crossing his arms in a gesture so reminiscent of Robert that Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "Our father died. That does not mean we need a replacement." "Mr. Yancy is not trying to replace your father," Clara said gently, pulling James onto her lap even though he was getting too big for it. "Your father will always be your father. Nobody can change that. But Mr. Yancy can help us survive the winter and give us a place to live. That is all this is, sweetheart, a way for us to be safe." "Do we have to call him Papa?" Sarah asked quietly. "No," Clara said firmly. "You can call him Mr. Yancy or Bennett if he says it is all right, or sir. Whatever feels comfortable to you. He understands that this is complicated." 2 days before the wedding, Clara packed up everything they owned, which was not much, and brought the children to Bennett's ranch as he had suggested. Bennett came out to meet them, and Clara could see him taking in the sight of all 6 children staring at him with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. "Hello," he said simply, addressing the children rather than Clara. "I am Bennett Yancy. Your mother has probably told you that she and I are going to be married. I know that is confusing and maybe frightening. I want you to know that this is your home now, too. Everything here belongs to all of us together. You have questions." It was Joseph who spoke first, always the bolder of the twins. "Do you have horses?" "I do," Bennett said. 6 horses and about 200 head of cattle and some chickens for eggs and a dog named Ranger who is around here somewhere." "Can we see the horses?" Joseph asked, his suspicion already fading in the face of the promise of horses. "After your mother and I talk, yes," Bennett said. "And if your mother says it is all right, I can teach you how to ride." That won over Joseph and James immediately, and even Sarah looked slightly more interested than she had before. Lucy had spotted a barn cat and was already trying to chase it, and William was clinging to Clara's skirt but watching Bennett with cautious curiosity. They spent the afternoon at the ranch, with Bennett showing the children around while Clara tried to figure out how to organize their meager belongings in this new space. Bennett was patient with the children, answering their questions in his quiet, straightforward way, and Clara found herself watching him with growing respect. He had meant what he said about wanting a full house. He was not just tolerating her children as an unfortunate necessity. He genuinely seemed to want them there. That evening, as they prepared to head back to the homestead for the last time before the wedding, Sarah pulled Clara aside. "Mama, do you love him?" Clara considered lying, then decided her daughter deserved the truth. "No, sweetheart, I do not love him. This is not that kind of marriage. This is a practical arrangement that will help us survive." "But you loved Papa," Sarah said, her voice small and sad. "I did," Clara agreed, pulling her daughter close. "I loved your Papa very much, and I will always love him. But love is not always enough to keep people fed and warm and safe. Sometimes we have to make difficult choices. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded against her shoulder, and Clara held her daughter and wished desperately that life could be simpler, that love could be enough, that she did not have to marry a stranger to keep her family together. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning at the small church in Lordsburg. Clara wore the same dress she had been married in the first time, carefully mended and cleaned. Bennett wore what appeared to be his only suit, slightly too tight across the shoulders. The children sat in the front pew, with Sarah holding Matthew and the others arranged in a subdued row. A few of the townspeople attended, mostly out of curiosity, Clara suspected. She could feel their judgment like a weight on her shoulders, could imagine the whispers about how quickly she had moved on from Robert, how desperate she must be to marry a strange, quiet man like Bennett Yancy. Reverend Matthews kept the ceremony short and simple, perhaps recognizing that this was not a love match but a practical union. When it came time for the vows, Bennett's voice was steady and sure, while Clara's trembled slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. They exchanged simple gold bands that Bennett had purchased in town, and then the Reverend was pronouncing them husband and wife, and it was done. Bennett did not kiss her. He simply took her hand briefly, his grip warm and solid, and then they were turning to face the children and the few gathered witnesses, and Clara was officially Mrs. Bennett Yancy, for better or worse. They had a small meal back at the ranch, simple fare that Bennett had prepared himself the night before. Clara was impressed by his cooking, which was basic but edible, better than she had expected from a bachelor who had lived alone for years. The children were quiet during the meal, still adjusting to this new reality, but Bennett made an effort to include them in conversation, asking them about their interests and their hopes for the ranch. That night, after the children were settled in their new rooms, Clara stood in her own room, the third bedroom that Bennett had assigned to her, and tried to process the fact that she was married again. Married to a man she barely knew, in a house that still felt foreign, with an uncertain future stretching ahead of her. She changed into her nightgown, braided her hair and climbed into bed, exhausted beyond measure. She did not know what she had expected from the first night of her marriage, but she had been braced for Bennett to knock on her door with expectations, despite his promises. So she was surprised when the house remained quiet, when no knock came, when morning arrived, and she woke to find she had slept through the night undisturbed. She found Bennett in the kitchen, already up and making breakfast. He looked up when she entered, and there was something almost shy in his expression. "Good morning. I hope I did not wake you." "You did not," Clara said, moving to help him. "You should have woken me. This is my responsibility now." "There is no harm in sharing responsibilities," Bennett said. "I have been cooking my own breakfast for years. I do not expect you to wait on me." It was such a small thing, but it set the tone for those first difficult weeks of adjustment. Bennett was unfailingly courteous, careful to give Clara and the children space to settle in, never pushing or demanding more than they could give. He went about his work on the ranch as usual, but made time to show the boys how to care for the horses and helped Lucy collect eggs from the chicken coop, and sat patiently, while Sarah asked him questions about ranch management that suggested she was testing his knowledge and his character. Clara fell into a routine of managing the household, cooking and cleaning and caring for Matthew, and trying to turn Bennett's bachelor house into something that felt like a home. It was strange, this domestic life with a man who was legally her husband but who remained a stranger in many ways. They were polite to each other, careful, maintaining a distance that felt both necessary and increasingly uncomfortable. At night, Clara lay in her bed alone and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. She thought about Robert, about the love they had shared and the life they had built together. She thought about Bennett, sleeping in his small room off the kitchen, and wondered what he was thinking, whether he regretted this arrangement, whether he was as lonely as she felt despite being surrounded by people. One evening about 3 weeks after the wedding, Clara was cleaning up after dinner while the children played outside under Sarah's supervision. Bennett came in from his evening chores and stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Is something wrong?" Clara asked, pausing with a dish in her hands. "No," Bennett said. Then, after a moment, "Yes, maybe, I do not know how to say this." Clara set down the dish, suddenly nervous. "Just say it plainly, that seems to be your way." Bennett moved into the kitchen, leaning against the counter but maintaining a respectful distance. "This arrangement, this marriage, it is not what I expected." Clara's heart sank. "You regret it?" "No," Bennett said quickly, firmly. "That is not what I meant. I meant that it is better than I expected. The children, they are good kids, loud and messy and full of energy, but good. And you have been working yourself nearly to death trying to take care of everything. I look at you and I see someone who is trying so hard to hold it all together, and I wonder if this arrangement is really helping you or just adding more burden." Clara was quiet for a long moment, trying to figure out how to respond. Finally, she said, "It is helping. My children are fed. They are warm, they are safe, that is what matters." "But what about you?" Bennett asked, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him more closely. "Are you fed? Are you warm? Are you safe?" "I am all of those things," Clara said carefully. "Are you happy?" Bennett pressed. The question caught her off guard. "I do not know that happiness is something I have the luxury of considering right now." "Maybe it should be," Bennett said. "Maybe we both should consider it." Before Clara could respond, they heard a crash from outside followed by Lucy's crying. They both rushed out to find that Lucy had fallen and scraped her knee badly, blood streaming down her leg. Clara hurried to comfort her daughter while Bennett went for clean water and bandages, moving with calm efficiency. Together, they cleaned and dressed the wound, with Bennett distracting Lucy by telling her a story about when he was a boy and had fallen out of a tree and broken his arm. Later, after Lucy was settled and the other children were getting ready for bed, Clara found Bennett on the porch, staring out at the darkening landscape. She joined him, keeping a proper distance but feeling drawn to his quiet presence. "Thank you for helping with Lucy," she said. "She is a sweet child," Bennett said. "They all are." "Even when the twins tracked mud through your clean kitchen yesterday?" Clara asked with a slight smile. "Even then," Bennett confirmed, and there was the hint of answering humor in his voice. "Though I will admit, I was less pleased in the moment." They stood in companionable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Finally, Clara said, "What you asked earlier about happiness. I do not know if I can be happy again. Not the way I was with Robert. That was a different kind of life. This is about survival and making the best of a difficult situation." "And if it became more than that?" Bennett asked quietly. "Would that be so terrible?" Clara looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean that we are married, whether by choice or necessity. We share a home. We are raising your children together. We could continue as we are, polite strangers living parallel lives under the same roof, or we could try to become something more. Friends, at least." Maybe eventually more than friends. The suggestion made Clara's pulse quicken with something that was part fear and part something else she was not ready to name. "I cannot promise you love, Bennett. I told you that from the beginning." "I am not asking for promises," Bennett said. "I am just asking if you would be willing to try, to see if there could be something between us beyond this arrangement we have made." Clara thought about it, about the way Bennett had been with her children, patient and kind, about the way he had helped her without expecting anything in return, about the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not watching, with an expression that suggested he saw not just a practical solution to his loneliness, but a woman he genuinely wanted to know. "I suppose I could try," she said finally, softly. "I cannot guarantee anything, but I could try." Bennett nodded, and even in the dim light of evening she could see relief in his expression. "That is all I ask." After that conversation, something shifted between them, subtle but significant. They began to talk more in the evenings after the children were in bed, sharing stories about their pasts and their hopes for the future. Clara learned that Bennett had grown up on this ranch, the only child of parents who had died within a year of each other, leaving him alone at 27. He had never married because he had never found anyone who seemed to fit into his quiet, solitary life. Until he saw Clara in the general store, and something in him recognized something in her, a kindred spirit somehow, despite their very different circumstances. Bennett learned about Clara's life with Robert, about how they had married young and full of hope, about the struggles of trying to make a homestead work with limited resources, about the slow, terrible process of watching Robert die from consumption while being powerless to stop it. He learned about her fear that she was failing her children, that she was not enough to protect them and provide for them the way they deserved. "You are enough," Bennett told her one evening as they sat together on the porch, a routine that had become comfortable over the passing weeks. "More than enough. You have kept 6 children alive and relatively healthy through impossible circumstances. That takes strength and courage most people cannot imagine." "I had no choice," Clara said. "You do what you have to do for your children." "Not everyone does," Bennett said. "Some people give up. Some people make choices that harm their children rather than protect them. You did not do that. Give yourself credit for it." His words touched something deep inside her, a place that had been aching with inadequacy and fear for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to believe in herself. She found herself blinking back tears, and when Bennett noticed, he did something he had never done before. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "I am sorry," he said. "I did not mean to make you cry." "These are not sad tears," Clara said, squeezing his hand. "Thank you, Bennett, for seeing me, for seeing us, for caring enough to try." They sat there holding hands until Clara heard Matthew crying from inside, and she reluctantly pulled away to tend to him. But something had changed between them that night. A wall coming down, a bridge being built across the careful distance they had maintained. As autumn deepened into winter, Clara found herself watching Bennett with increasing awareness. The way he moved through the world with quiet competence. The way he was teaching James and Joseph to ride, patient with their mistakes and generous with his praise. The way he sat with Sarah in the evening sometimes, answering her questions about ranching with the seriousness they deserved, treating her not as a child but as a young woman whose opinions mattered. The way he made silly faces to get Lucy to laugh, and held Matthew with unexpected gentleness for such a large man. She noticed other things too. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which was happening more and more often. The way his voice got softer when he talked to her, as if she was something precious that needed careful handling. The way he looked at her sometimes with an expression that made her heart beat faster and her cheeks warm. It frightened her, this growing awareness, because it felt like a betrayal of Robert's memory. She had loved her first husband deeply, had thought she would never feel anything like that for anyone else. But what she was beginning to feel for Bennett was different from what she had felt for Robert. With Robert, it had been the passionate love of youth, all fire and intensity. With Bennett, it was something quieter, deeper, built on respect and shared responsibility and the gradual uncovering of who they were beneath the surface. Winter arrived in full force in late November, bringing cold winds and occasional snow. Clara was grateful every day for the solid warmth of Bennett's house, for the well-stocked pantry and the working stove, and the security of knowing her children would not go hungry. She was grateful for Bennett too, though she had not quite found the courage to tell him so. The first real snow came in early December, blanketing the ranch in white. The children were thrilled, running outside to play despite the cold. Clara watched from the window as Bennett joined them, helping the boys build a snowman and pulling Lucy on a makeshift sled, and even convincing Sarah to throw a few snowballs in a spirited battle that left them all laughing and covered in snow. When they all trooped back inside, cheeks red and fingers numb, Clara had hot cocoa waiting for them, a luxury she could afford now thanks to Bennett's resources. She passed out mugs and watched her children's faces light up with simple joy, and felt a wave of gratitude so intense it was almost painful. That evening, after the children were in bed, she found Bennett in the kitchen, warming his hands around his own mug of cocoa. Without letting herself think too hard about it, Clara moved close to him and said, "I want to thank you." "For what?" Bennett asked, looking surprised. "For today, for every day, for giving my children their childhood back. They have been through so much, and today they were just children again, playing in the snow without worry. That is because of you." Bennett set down his mug and turned to face her fully. "They are good kids, Clara. It is not a hardship to make them happy." "Still," Clara said, "I wanted you to know that I see what you are doing, how hard you are trying, and I am grateful." She stood on tiptoe and kissed his cheek, a quick, impulsive gesture that surprised them both. When she pulled back, Bennett was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, something intense and vulnerable at the same time. "Clara," he said, his voice rough, "I need you to know something. This arrangement, this marriage, it is not just practical for me anymore. I care about you, about all of you. I do not want you to feel pressured or obligated, but I needed to say it. I care about you." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I care about you too," she whispered. "It frightens me how much I am starting to care." "Why does it frighten you?" Bennett asked, reaching up to gently touch her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with heartbreaking tenderness. "Because I did not think I could feel this way again," Clara admitted. "I thought that part of me died with Robert. And it feels like a betrayal to feel this way about someone else." "Love is not a finite resource," Bennett said softly. "You can love Robert's memory and still have room in your heart for something new. That is not betrayal. That is being human. Is that what this is?" Clara asked, searching his face. "Love? I think it might be," Bennett said. "At least on my part. I love the way you care for your children with such fierce devotion. I love the way you face difficulties with courage even when you are terrified. I love the way you have started to smile again, real smiles that reach your eyes. I love you, Clara. I do not need you to say it back. I just needed you to know." Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks, and this time she did not try to stop them. "I am not ready to say it yet," she said honestly. "But I think I am starting to feel it." "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Bennett said, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her close while she cried against his chest, releasing months of tension and fear and grief and tentative hope. His arms around her felt safe and warm and right, and Clara let herself lean into that feeling. Let herself be held and comforted by this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly and changed everything. They stood like that for a long time, and when Clara finally pulled back, Bennett wiped the tears from her face with gentle fingers. "I should go to bed," she said, but made no move to leave. "You should," Bennett agreed, but he was looking at her like he never wanted to let her go. On impulse, Clara reached up and kissed him, not on the cheek this time but on the mouth, a tentative, questioning kiss that Bennett returned with careful restraint. It was nothing like the passionate kisses she had shared with Robert in their youth, but it was sweet and tender and full of promise, and when they pulled apart, Clara was smiling. "Good night, Bennett," she said softly. "Good night, Clara," he replied, his voice warm with affection. As Clara climbed the stairs to her room, she felt lighter than she had in months. She was not entirely sure what was happening between her and Bennett, but for the first time since Robert's death, she was beginning to believe that happiness might be possible again after all. Christmas approached, and Clara threw herself into making it special for the children. With Bennett's resources, she was able to buy small gifts for each of them and ingredients for a proper Christmas dinner. Bennett contributed by cutting down a pine tree, which they decorated with strings of popcorn and paper ornaments the children made. On Christmas morning, the children woke to find presents under the tree, modest but meaningful. For the boys, small pocket knives. For Sarah, a beautiful leather-bound journal. For Lucy, a new doll to replace her worn one. For Matthew, a wooden horse that Bennett had carved himself. The children were thrilled, and Clara watched their joy with a full heart. Bennett had a gift for her too, a beautiful shawl in a deep blue color that brought out her eyes. When she opened it, she was speechless, running her fingers over the soft wool. "It is too much," she protested. "It is not nearly enough," Bennett said. "You deserve beautiful things, Clara." Clara had a gift for him too, a shirt she had sewn from fabric she had purchased in town, working on it late at night when he was asleep. It was nothing fancy, but she had put care into every stitch, and when Bennett opened it, the look on his face made all the late nights worth it. "Thank you," he said, and there was such genuine pleasure in his voice that Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. That night, after the children were in bed exhausted from excitement, Clara and Bennett sat together by the fireplace in the parlor, watching the flames dance. Clara was wearing her new shawl and Bennett had changed into his new shirt, and there was a comfortable intimacy in the gesture. "This was a good Christmas," Clara said softly. "The best I have had in years," Bennett agreed. "Maybe the best I have ever had." Clara leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that was becoming more natural every day. "I am glad you proposed to me that day in the general store." "So am I," Bennett said, wrapping his arm around her. "Best decision I ever made." They sat there in peaceful silence, and Clara felt something settle in her chest, something that felt almost like contentment. She was not entirely healed from her grief over Robert, and she was not entirely sure of her feelings for Bennett, but she was starting to believe that they were building something real and lasting, a foundation that could support a genuine marriage rather than just an arrangement of convenience. As winter deepened, Clara and Bennett grew closer. They still maintained separate rooms, but the distance between them was shrinking. They held hands sometimes while walking around the property. Bennett would kiss her forehead or cheek in passing. Clara would touch his arm or shoulder when she spoke to him. Small gestures, but meaningful ones, building toward something neither of them was quite ready to name out loud. The children noticed the change, of course. Sarah seemed pleased, though she was careful not to say too much. The younger children simply accepted Bennett more and more as a natural part of their family. Matthew, who had been too young to remember Robert clearly, started reaching for Bennett whenever he was upset, a development that brought tears to Clara's eyes when she first noticed it. In late January, a fierce storm moved through the area, dumping snow for 3 days straight and trapping them all inside. Clara worried that being cooped up would lead to tension and conflict, but instead, those 3 days became some of her favorite memories. They played games together as a family. Bennett taught the children card games and told stories about growing up on the ranch. Clara made enormous meals that they ate together at the big kitchen table. Sarah played the old piano in the parlor that had belonged to Bennett's mother, filling the house with music. On the 3rd night of the storm, after the children were finally asleep, Clara and Bennett sat together on the sofa in the parlor, closer than they had ever been before. The fire was burning low, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and outside the wind was howling, but inside everything was warm and safe. "I love you," Clara said suddenly, the words escaping before she had fully decided to say them. But as soon as they were out, she knew they were true. She did love him, differently than she had loved Robert, but no less real, no less deep. Bennett went very still beside her. "You do not have to say that just because I did." "I am not," Clara said, turning to face him fully. "I am saying it because it is true. I love you, Bennett Yancy. I love your quiet strength and your patience with my children, and the way you make me feel safe. I love the way you look at me like I am something precious. I love the man you are, and I want this to be a real marriage in every sense of the word." Bennett's eyes were bright in the firelight, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel pressured or rushed." "I am sure," Clara said firmly. "I have been sure for a while now. I was just too frightened to admit it. But I am tired of being frightened. Life is too short to waste time being afraid of happiness." Bennett cupped her face in his hands, his touch achingly gentle. "I love you so much, Clara. I will spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy." "You already do," Clara whispered, and then they were kissing, not tentatively this time, but with real passion, real promise. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "Come with me," Bennett said, standing and offering his hand. Clara took it without hesitation, and let him lead her to his small room off the kitchen. That night, their marriage became real in every way, and Clara fell asleep in Bennett's arms feeling more at peace than she had been in years. The next morning, Clara woke to find Bennett watching her with an expression of such tenderness it made her heart ache. "Good morning, wife," he said softly. "Good morning, husband," Clara replied, and the words felt different now, weighted with meaning they had not had before. They had to get up and face the day and the children, but they stole a few more minutes to simply hold each other, to revel in this new intimacy that had been building for months and had finally found its full expression. When they emerged from Bennett's room together, Sarah was in the kitchen starting breakfast. She looked up, saw them together, saw something in their faces that made her smile and said nothing, but Clara could see approval in her daughter's eyes. Over the following weeks, Clara moved her things into Bennett's room, which they now shared as husband and wife in truth as well as name. The adjustment was surprisingly easy, as if this was what they had been moving toward all along. They were careful to maintain appropriate behavior in front of the children, but at night, in the privacy of their room, they were learning each other, building a physical intimacy to match the emotional one they had developed. Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow and revealing the brown earth beneath. With the warmer weather came more work on the ranch, and Clara found herself learning things she had never known before. Bennett taught her about managing cattle and horses, about the rhythms of ranch life. The boys were old enough now to help with real work, and Bennett was patient in teaching them what they needed to know. Sarah, too, was learning, and Clara could see her daughter thriving under Bennett's quiet guidance. At 15, Sarah was becoming a young woman, and she needed a father figure to help guide her into adulthood. Bennett filled that role with sensitivity and wisdom, treating Sarah with respect while still maintaining appropriate boundaries. One evening in April, Clara realized with a start that she had not thought about Robert in several days. The realization brought guilt immediately, but then she pushed the guilt away. Robert would have wanted her to be happy. He would have wanted his children to be cared for and loved. He would not have wanted her to spend her life mourning him. She mentioned this to Bennett that night as they lay in bed together, and he held her close and said, "Loving me does not mean you have stopped loving him. You can hold both of us in your heart. Love is not a competition." "When did you become so wise?" Clara asked, smiling against his chest. "I have always been wise," Bennett said with mock seriousness. "You just did not notice before." Clara laughed and swatted his arm, and Bennett caught her hand and kissed it, and they fell asleep tangled together, comfortable in the life they had built. In May, Clara began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited a few weeks to be sure before telling Bennett, worried about how he might react. They had not discussed having children together, had been so focused on helping her existing 6 children adjust to their new life that the possibility of adding to their family had not come up. But when she finally told him one evening after dinner, Bennett's face lit up with such genuine joy that all her worries evaporated. "Really?" he asked, pulling her close. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Clara said, feeling tears of happiness prick her eyes. "Are you pleased?" "Pleased," Bennett said, laughing. "I am thrilled, Clara. Absolutely thrilled. A baby. Our baby." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Clara felt a wave of love for this man who had taken on 6 children who were not his own without hesitation, and was now so excited to have a child of his own. He was a good man, the best man she had ever known besides Robert, and she was grateful every day that he had noticed her in the general store and been brave enough to make his extraordinary proposal. They told the children the next day. The reactions were mixed, as Clara had expected. The younger ones were excited about a baby. Sarah looked concerned but ultimately supportive. The twins were mostly indifferent, more interested in their ranch work than in babies. As Clara's pregnancy progressed through the summer, she found herself happier than she had been since before Robert got sick. Her children were thriving. Her marriage was strong. She had a home and security and love. She had thought she would never have any of those things again, and yet here she was, expecting a baby with a man she loved deeply. Bennett was attentive during her pregnancy, taking on extra household work when she was tired, making sure she ate properly, worrying over every small complaint. It was endearing, if sometimes a bit excessive. "I am not fragile," Clara told him one evening when he tried to prevent her from lifting a moderately heavy pot. "I have done this 6 times before." "But you did not have me to help you before," Bennett said stubbornly. "Let me take care of you, Clara. Please." How could she argue with that? So she let him fuss, let him care for her, and found that she liked being cared for, liked feeling precious and protected. In October, Clara went into labor early one morning. Bennett was immediately anxious, sending Joseph riding for the doctor in town while he helped Clara get settled. Sarah took charge of the younger children with impressive competence, while Bennett stayed with Clara, holding her hand and offering comfort. The labor was long but not complicated, and by evening, Clara was holding a healthy baby boy while Bennett looked on with an expression of such wonder and love that it made her heart overflow. "A son," Bennett said, his voice rough with emotion. "We have a son, Clara." "We do," Clara agreed, smiling through her exhaustion. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names but had not made a final decision. Now, looking at the tiny baby with a surprisingly full head of dark hair like his father's, Clara said, What about Thomas? Thomas Robert Yancy. Bennett's eyes widened. Robert, after your first husband, he was the father of my children, Clara said. And he was a good man. I want to honor his memory, and I want our son to know that love and family come in many forms. Bennett leaned down and kissed her forehead. Thomas Robert Yancy. I love it. Thank you, Clara, for everything, for marrying me, for loving me, for giving me this family. You have made my life so much richer than I ever imagined it could be. You saved us, Clara said, touching his face. You saved all of us when we had nowhere else to turn. I will never forget that. We saved each other, Bennett corrected gently. I was dying of loneliness before you and the children came into my life. You gave me purpose and joy and a reason to look forward to each day. We saved each other. The children were allowed in to meet their new brother, and even the boys seemed impressed by the tiny baby. Lucy was enthralled, wanting to hold him immediately. Sarah had tears in her eyes as she looked at the baby, and Clara realized with a start that her oldest daughter was happy for her, genuinely happy that she had found love again. As the days turned into weeks and Thomas grew and thrived, Clara reflected on how much her life had changed in just over a year. She had gone from desperate widow with no hope to happily married mother of 7 with a husband who adored her and a secure, comfortable life. It seemed almost too good to be true, and yet it was true. It was real. Bennett was a wonderful father to Thomas, getting up with him in the night and walking him around when he was fussy and changing his diapers without complaint. He was equally devoted to the other 6 children, never showing favoritism, always making sure they knew they were his children too, even if not by blood. One evening the following spring, almost 2 years after that day in the general store when Bennett had paid for her supplies, Clara was standing on the porch watching the sunset. Thomas was nearly 6 months old now, a happy, chubby baby who smiled at everyone. The older children were doing evening chores, their voices drifting across the yard. Bennett came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "About how lucky I am," Clara said, leaning into his embrace. "About how close I came to losing everything and how you saved us." "I have told you before," Bennett said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We saved each other." "I love you," Clara said, turning in his arms to face him. "I love you so much, Bennett Yancy, more than I ever thought I could love anyone again." "And I love you, Clara Yancy," Bennett said, cupping her face in his hands. "I thank God every day for bringing you into my life. You and all these children, you are my everything." They kissed as the sun set over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Inside the house, they could hear the children laughing about something, and baby Thomas starting to fuss, and all the sounds of a full, rich life. As they pulled apart, Bennett said, "Do you remember what you told me the first time I proposed? That you had no hope?" "I remember," Clara said softly. "And now?" Bennett asked, searching her eyes. Clara smiled, genuine and bright and full of the joy that had seemed so impossible that day in the general store. "Now I have more hope than I ever imagined possible. Now I have everything." And she did. She had love and family and security. She had a husband who cherished her and children who were thriving. She had overcome impossible odds and found happiness on the other side of grief. She had gone from widow with 6 children, and no hope to wife and mother with a full heart and a rich life. That night, after all the children were in bed and Thomas was sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Clara and Bennett lay together in their room, tangled up in each other the way they always were now, and talked about the future. "You think we will have more children?" Clara asked, tracing patterns on Bennett's chest with her fingers. "Would you want more?" Bennett asked, sounding surprised. Maybe, Clara said thoughtfully. I am 32. I could have another one or two before it becomes too risky, and I love seeing you with Thomas. You are such a good father. I love seeing you as a mother, Bennett said. You are extraordinary with all of them, but I do not need more children to be happy, Clara. I already have 7. That is more than most men could hope for. But they are not all yours, Clara pointed out. They are mine in every way that matters, Bennett said firmly. I do not care about blood. Those 6 children are mine because I choose them and they have chosen me. That is more real than any biological connection. Clara felt her eyes fill with tears. How did I get so lucky to find you? Luck had nothing to do with it, Bennett said, pulling her closer. It was meant to be. I truly believe that. We were meant to find each other, meant to build this life together. Over the next few years, their life continued to unfold in ways that brought constant joy and occasional challenges, the normal rhythm of family life. The older children grew and changed. Sarah turned 18 and started being courted by a nice young man from town, which made Clara feel simultaneously proud and old. The twins became strong, capable young men who loved working on the ranch. William grew out of his shyness and became quite the talker. Lucy remained sweet and gentle, a helper with Thomas and with the household. Matthew, who had been a baby when Bennett came into their lives, grew into a lively boy with no memory of life before the ranch. Thomas thrived, growing into a sturdy toddler with his father's serious demeanor and his mother's smile. And when he was 3 years old, Clara found herself pregnant again. This time, she was less anxious about telling Bennett, knowing how he would react. She was right. He was overjoyed, and 9 months later, they welcomed a daughter they named Elizabeth Ann. 2 years after that, another daughter arrived, Emma Grace. Bennett joked that he was building his own ranch crew, and Clara laughed and told him that 9 children were quite enough. Thank you very much. As the years passed, the older children began to leave home, starting lives of their own. Sarah married her young man and moved to a homestead not far away. When the twins turned 21, they asked Bennett for help starting their own ranch, and he gave it gladly, helping them find good land and get started with their own cattle. William went to work for the railroad. Lucy married a merchant in town. Matthew chose to stay on the ranch, working alongside Bennett and making it clear that he intended to be a rancher like his stepfather. And the 3 youngest, Thomas and Elizabeth and Emma, were still at home, filling the house with noise and laughter and the chaos of childhood. One evening, when Clara was 45 and Bennett was 50, they sat together on their porch watching the sunset, just as they had done countless times over the years. The ranch was thriving. Their children were healthy and happy, scattered across New Mexico territory, but always coming back for visits. They had built a good life together, a life neither of them could have imagined that day in the general store when Bennett had made his unexpected proposal. You ever regret it? Clara asked suddenly. Taking on a widow with 6 children, the instant family, all the responsibility, Bennett turned to look at her with such love in his eyes that it still made her heart skip after all these years. Never, not for a single moment, marrying you was the best thing I ever did. You gave me everything I did not even know I wanted, a family, a purpose, love. You gave me a life worth living, Clara. You gave me the same, Clara said, taking his hand. When you approached me in that store, I had given up. I thought my life was over except for the work of keeping my children alive. I never imagined I could be happy again. But you showed me I could. You showed me that love comes in many forms and that it is possible to build something beautiful even from desperate circumstances. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant colors. In the house behind them, They could hear their three youngest children arguing about something, and Clara smiled at the familiar sound. "We did well, did we not?" Bennett said softly. "We did," Clara agreed. "We did very well indeed." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara thought about that frightened, desperate woman she had been, standing in the general store with her children around her and no hope for the future. She thought about the quiet rancher who had seen her struggle and offered an unexpected lifeline. She thought about how far they had come, how much they had built together, how much love they had found in a marriage that started as pure practicality. Life in the New Mexico territory was still hard. There were droughts and harsh winters, sick cattle and financial worries, the constant challenges that came with ranching in an unforgiving land. But they faced it all together, she and Bennett, partners in every sense of the word. They had grown from strangers making a practical arrangement to lovers who could not imagine life without each other. They had become a family, blended and complicated and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. "Come inside," Clara said finally, standing and pulling Bennett up with her. "The children will be getting hungry, and I need to start dinner." "I will help you," Bennett said, as he always did. They walked into their home together, hand in hand, surrounded by the sounds and warmth of the family they had created. And Clara thought, not for the first time, that hope could be found in the most unexpected places. Sometimes it came in the form of a quiet rancher making a proposal in a general store. Sometimes it came wrapped in hardship and struggle that eventually blossomed into something beautiful. But it always came if you were brave enough to reach for it. Years continued to pass, marked by the seasons and the milestones of their growing family. The ranch expanded as Bennett and Matthew worked together, father and son in everything but blood, to build something that could sustain multiple generations. When Sarah had her first child, Clara became a grandmother, a role she embraced with joy. More grandchildren followed as the older children married and started families of their own. Through it all, Clara and Bennett's love continued to deepen. They had their disagreements, of course, their moments of friction that came with any marriage. But they had learned early on how to talk to each other, how to work through problems together rather than letting resentment build. They had learned to be partners in the truest sense, supporting each other through good times and bad. When Clara turned 50, Bennett organized a huge celebration at the ranch, bringing together all their children and grandchildren for a weekend of food and laughter and family. As Clara looked around at the chaos of her enormous family, at the children and grandchildren who were there because she had been brave enough to accept Bennett's proposal all those years ago, she felt overwhelming gratitude for the path her life had taken. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed or to the barn where they were sleeping in makeshift accommodations, Clara and Bennett sat alone by the fire in their parlor. 50 years old, Clara mused. How did that happen? I still feel like that frightened young widow sometimes. You are nothing like that woman anymore, Bennett said, pulling her close. You are strong and confident and surrounded by people who love you. That woman in the general store, she was surviving. You are living. Because of you, Clara said, looking up at him. Because of us, Bennett corrected. Because we chose each other, and chose to build something real from an arrangement that could have remained cold and practical. We made this life together, Clara. Both of us. As they sat there together, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with desperation and a practical proposal, but it had become so much more. It had become a love story, unconventional perhaps, but no less real and beautiful for its unusual beginning. The children they had raised together, both hers and theirs, had grown into good people. Sarah was a devoted mother and wife. The twins had successful ranches of their own. William had risen to a supervisory position with the railroad. Lucy was happy in her marriage and active in her church community. Matthew was running the ranch alongside Bennett with skill and dedication. Thomas was studying to be a doctor. Emma was teaching school in town, and Elizabeth had just gotten engaged to a fine young man from Lordsburg. 9 children, Clara thought with wonder. She had raised 9 children with Bennett, and all of them were thriving. They had done that together, she and this quiet, serious man who had seen her struggling and offered help without expecting anything in return. The years continued their relentless march forward. When Bennett turned 60, he began to slow down a bit, letting Matthew take on more of the heavy ranch work. Clara's hair turned silver, and laugh lines deepened around her eyes and mouth. They aged together, growing old side by side, and Clara could not imagine any other way she would want to spend her later years. They had been married 25 years when Bennett decided to formally adopt the older 6 children who were not biologically his. They were all adults by then, living their own lives, but Bennett wanted to make it official, wanted them to have his name if they wanted it. All 6 agreed immediately, and the legal proceedings that followed were emotional and meaningful for everyone involved. "You have always been our father," Sarah told Bennett at the small celebration afterward. "This just makes it official." Bennett had tears in his eyes as he hugged each of his adopted children, and Clara watched with a full heart, thinking about how far they had all come from that desperate day in the general store. When Clara was 60 and Bennett was 67, they took a trip together, leaving the ranch in Matthew and his wife's capable hands and traveling to California to visit William, who had transferred there for work. It was the first time they had been truly alone together since the early days of their marriage, before Thomas was born, and they rediscovered each other in new ways. They walked along the ocean, something Clara had never seen before, and marveled at its vastness. They talked for hours about their life together, about their children and grandchildren, about their hopes for the future. They made love in a hotel room with the sound of waves crashing outside, and afterward, Clara lay in Bennett's arms and thought about how lucky she was to have found this man, to have built this life with him. "I love you more now than I ever have," she told him that night. "Is that strange? After all these years, I love you more every day." "Not strange at all," Bennett said, kissing her forehead. "I feel the same way. You are my everything, Clara. Always have been, from the moment I saw you in that store. I just had to wait for you to catch up." They returned to the ranch refreshed and more in love than ever, ready to embrace the next chapter of their life together. And there were many more chapters to come. More grandchildren were born. Some of their older grandchildren started having children of their own, making Clara and Bennett great-grandparents. The family tree they had planted together continued to grow and branch, spreading across New Mexico territory and beyond. Through it all, Clara and Bennett remained at the center, the foundation upon which this enormous family was built. They had shown their children and grandchildren what real love looked like, how partnership and respect and commitment could sustain a marriage through decades. They had proven that family was about choice as much as blood, that love could grow from the most unlikely beginnings, that hope could be found even in the darkest circumstances. As they grew older, they relied on each other more and more, supporting each other through the inevitable health issues that came with age. When Bennett's joints started aching from years of hard ranch work, Clara was there with warm compresses and gentle massage. When Clara's eyesight began to fail, Bennett was there to read to her in the evenings, his voice steady and soothing as he shared stories and news. They celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by family, an enormous gathering that required renting tents and bringing in food from town. As Clara looked around at the sea of faces, all of them connected to her and Bennett in some way, she felt a sense of completion, of a life well lived. 30 years, Bennett said that evening as they danced together slowly to music played by several of their musically inclined grandchildren. The best 30 years of my life. Mine too, Clara said, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. Thank you for saving me, Bennett, for saving all of us. Thank you for letting me, Bennett replied. For taking a chance on a quiet rancher who did not have much to offer except a house and a heart that was ready to love. You had everything to offer, Clara said firmly, pulling back to look at him. Everything that mattered, and you still do. They continued to dance, moving slowly among their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, at the center of the world they had built together. And as the New Mexico sun set over the ranch that had been their home for 3 decades, Clara sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for that day in the general store, for Bennett's courage in making his proposal, for her own courage in accepting it, and for all the beautiful, messy, wonderful years that had followed. Their love story had started with desperation and practicality, but it had become something transcendent, proof that the best things in life often come from unexpected places, and that hope, real hope, is never truly lost as long as someone is brave enough to offer it, and someone else is brave enough to accept it. They had found each other when they both needed finding, had built a life and a family that would continue long after they were gone, and had proven that love, real love, could bloom even in the harshest conditions if tended with care and commitment and an open heart. As stars appeared in the darkening sky and their family celebrated around them, Clara and Bennett held each other close and knew, with absolute certainty, that they had chosen well all those years ago in Lordsburg. They had chosen each other, chosen hope over despair, chosen to build something beautiful from difficult circumstances. And what they had built together would stand as a testament to the power of love and family for generations to come, a legacy born from a widow's desperation, and a quiet rancher's proposal in a general store one autumn day in 1883.